Few people can have managed to avoid being affected by the tragic events taking place in Israel and Gaza in recent weeks. The suffering and pain being inflicted is hard to imagine in our peaceful island, which hasn't witnessed war and bloodshed for many decades. We have little power to influence these events, but should we not at least consider what's happening and use our comparatively small political voice to bring about meaningful change? Joni Farragher MHK certainly thinks so, and we'll hear from her later in the programme. But first, Phil Crane tells us about his experience in Israel and the West Bank.
I went out and spent a little time on an Israeli kibbutz. This would be 1978, and it was partly to do with travel, but I knew that the kibbutzim movement offered a sort of a cooperative setup whereby the Israelis came together to form a kind of collective farm, really, and they were open to volunteers from anywhere in the world coming out to help them to get a taste of that life. At that time, Israel had just a few years before then, in the Six-Day War, 1967, it had been invaded by Arab armies and had really routed them, and ended up, after those 6 days, in control of this entire Sinai Peninsula up to the Suez Canal. Also, it captured the Golan Heights from Syria and the entire West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which was a divided city up till 1967, from Jordan. And here we are 56 years later, and still with that reality. It's formally annexed East Jerusalem. It sees Jerusalem as its united eternal capital. But the West Bank is still Israeli controlled, but under the Oslo Accords in 1999, the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority, it's the faction called Fatah, which rules the West Bank under President Abbas. They were given limited autonomy within the West Bank, limited powers in health and education and in policing. But Israel still controls 60% of the West Bank directly. It's got now, I think, over 600,000 settlers encouraged to colonize the West Bank. So they've got the main roads, the strategically important and fertile Jordan Valley, but the Palestinians have got that limited autonomy in the major cities. So the map of the West Bank looks like a Swiss cheese, but Israel very much the dominant power there. So it was later on in 2014, 9 years ago now, that I went out to the West Bank as part of a Quaker-run human rights monitoring program, really, in 7 cities in the West Bank. And we were in teams of 4, 5 or 6 internationals, and we would be sent out each day to various places, often under the advice of the United Nations, which got a big presence out there. And I suppose we all witnessed in our way the effects of the ongoing Israeli occupation of the West Bank. So, for example, while I was there for those 3 months, I witnessed 7 house demolitions where the Israeli army will go in almost always at dawn, cut off the water, electricity, and demolish Palestinian homes. I was based in East Jerusalem, so every square foot of land is contested there, and the Palestinians have often built homes without an Israeli permit to build, and just to take their natural growth into account, and the Israelis have demolished them. And this goes on a regular basis. And of course, what you then find out is that 95% of all Palestinian applications to build a home are refused by the Israelis. So there's an ongoing colonization project going on there, and we witness not just the effects of the Israeli army, but also the growing number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank. We've now got, I think, 600,000 Israeli settlers amongst an indigenous Palestinian population of about 2.5 million. And they're now, of course, since then, they've been given the green light by the Israeli government to go on. Even what were illegal outposts in 2014 have now become regularized and encouraged by the quite hardline current Israeli government out there. We also went down to Sderot, which is just a couple of kilometres from the Gaza Strip border. We didn't enter Gaza Strip. It was the program doesn't work there. It was too dangerous back in 2014 even. Hamas controlled, unlike the Fatah on the West Bank. And we looked over from the Israeli side. We saw the Israeli fortifications along the border, the guard towers. We saw the swathes of no man's land, 2 or 3 huge metal barbed wire fences, and you could see Gaza City just 4 or 5 miles in the distance. In the town of Sderot, we were shown by Israelis I remember a kiddie's playground with swings and slides and roundabouts, and among that you had this very long concrete serpent, drawn up just a long tube above ground level, and they said, guess what that is? And they explained it was a shelter from missiles, which even then were being launched from Gaza by Hamas on the very close town of Sderot. And it was explained that when these missiles come, the Israelis' alarm goes off, the sirens go off, and the kiddies have 15 seconds to enter the rear door at the back of the serpent, and it's an underground air raid shelter. And so that brings it home. We also spoke to Israelis in Sderot who'd had to put up with the terror of those attacks at night, and people who had, despite all that, Israelis who had set up an organisation which was in dialoguing with Gazan citizens, trying to build peace in that. So that's what I witnessed out there.
So going back then to your very early days, your early involvement back in the 70s. I mean, that was within 30 years of the atrocities absolutely appalling situation with the way in which the Jewish people were treated by the Nazis with the Holocaust. There would be quite some raw memories among the people that you would have been working with.
Very much so, and I can remember on the kibbutz one day a young German girl, West German at the time, turned up at the kibbutz, and she was expecting to work there, picking oranges like the rest of us, and she was refused entry because somehow an elderly Israeli woman had got involved and put a spoke in the works, because she was a victim of the Nazi Holocaust, and she had on her forearm she still had her number tattooed on it by the Nazis in the concentration camp, and she was not going to have a German working on her kibbutz in Israel. Those memories didn't die. And she was turned away. I remember when I was out there in 2014, I visited the Yad Vashem, the Israel's National Museum to the Holocaust. It's in a leafy suburb of West Jerusalem, and you go through that. Very moving. It showed how centuries before Hitler came along, how the European nations had treated the Jews. There were riots against them in York in 1190. They'd been banished from England. They were later expelled from Spain. Pogroms in the 17th, 18th centuries in Russia and Poland. They've always had a hard time. And then the Holocaust. You go through the galleries of the Holocaust. The growing antipathy in the 30s and in Germany, and then the war breaks out, the concentration camps, the trains, the gas chambers, the pits are all there in graphic detail. And one of the displays, just a sentence jumped out at me, which I still remember, and it was by a Jew I think at that time, maybe in the 30s, called Kurt Tucholsky, and he said, "A nation is not just what it does; it's what it tolerates." And those words have stuck to me, and I think they're still very pertinent to the situation today. It's what we tolerate as a nation that matters.
Knowing the history of the Jewish people and how Israel then came into being, at least in the 20th century, it's hard for us in an Isle of Man situation where we've really had such a wonderfully peaceful life, probably for several hundred years. Obviously many people in the Isle of Man did take part in the First and Second World Wars. But most of us have had a relatively peaceful, relatively easy existence pretty much since the time the Vikings came. How does this get resolved? Because, you can absolutely understand that the Jewish people have a right to have a homeland and an existence and a peaceful existence.
Yes.
And yet, on the other hand, you can understand that if somebody just decided, instead of moving the people of Israel into what we now understand Israel to be, but they said, "Oh well, no, we'll ship them all to the Isle of Man, and the Manxis can just go." How would we feel? I mean, so yeah, I struggle to understand how this can be resolved.
Yes. I mean, you're right, Phil. We've had almost 80 years of peace in Western Europe. Since the 1945, I guess, and we've come to take that for granted, and it's not the case in many parts of the rest of the world, not just the Middle East. Yes, of course, the Jews have a right to their own homeland after what they'd been through. I think when you look back in history, a lot depends on when you set the clock. Back in the times of the Roman Empire, Palestine was a Roman province, and it was the Jews' biblical homeland at that point. Fast forward, if you choose the date 1900, you find Palestine is a province of the Ottoman Empire, and the Turkish authorities did a census there in 1900, and at that point only 5% of the population of Palestine was Jewish. The rest were Arab. And so it goes on. But then 1948, you have the creation of the state of Israel, at last a safe homeland for the Jewish people, and you can't underestimate the importance of that for them. But then you have the contested indigenous population. As you say, how would we feel if foreign people came and colonized our land, our island? And then particularly since the Six-Day Wars, I mentioned in 1967, you've had an Israeli occupation by the military in the West Bank, and backed up by, as I said, an increasing number of settlers going there. And you have the rival Hamas regime, de facto regime, not recognized at all in Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is smaller than the Isle of Man. It's just 25 miles long and 8 miles wide at its widest, with 2.3 million people there. If you look at it on Google Earth, it's almost totally urbanized and high-rise blocks, as we've seen on the terrible pictures, and with just a few fields on the outskirts. It's been called the world's largest refugee camp. And what happened on the 7th of October, amazingly, despite what I said about those Israeli defences, Hamas militias broke them all down and somehow got through and attacked Sderot, the very place I was mentioning, and neighbourhood towns, villages, settlements, kibbutzim. And they massacred 1,400 children, adults, old people, as we know, in their homes, and absolutely appalling atrocities. And we should think, what makes human beings do that? That it didn't happen in a vacuum, as Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said. It happened after 55 years of brutal occupation and frustration, that the Palestinian aims were not being listened to, and of really appalling leadership on the part of the Palestinians too, it has to be said. That frustration has exploded in a way that nobody, least of all Israel, expected.
And actually, the comments of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, inflamed the Israelis.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
that they were absolutely
They called for
livid.
his resignation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can you understand why they might react like that?
Yes, I can. I think they were taking his comments to mean that he was somehow condoning the attacks, which he later clarified it and said, no, I'm not condoning it at all. I'm totally condemning what happened on the 7th of October by Hamas. But I think he was trying to understand what makes human beings do this. It didn't happen in a vacuum.
And that's one of the hardest things about understanding, particularly conflicts, because we always like to assume that there's good guys and bad guys. The good guys generally win and the bad guys lose. I mean, that's the oversimplification, and it sounds very crass the way I've described it, and yet that's pretty much what we read on the front page of most newspapers, and inevitably the way in which media, with relatively short time to put over messages, it ends up being very much a very simplistic view of things. And yet often, well, it's very clear in this situation, it's the most complex of political problems to solve.
Yes. And Hamas took the lives of 1,400 Israelis, and now we see day after day Israel going in, and I think the latest figure to date was 8,700 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza onslaught. You can't measure one number against another number, but when it comes to deaths, each one is a tragedy, of course, but this is continuing to go on. And I'm just wondering, from Israel's own long-term interest, whether they are digging themselves into a deeper and deeper hole.
Because clearly the Israeli aim, very clearly stated aim, is to wipe Hamas off the face of the earth.
And that can't be done. A 7-year-old Gazan boy will witness what's going on there today, and as soon as he is 12 years old, he will be signing up to Hamas. The Palestinian cause is endemic to what's going on, and that cannot be eradicated. Israel seems to think it can. And what happens the day after Israel's current rage is sated? What happens the day after?
And you say it can't be. I mean, presumably, you're an optimistic sort of person. You must feel that there is a solution to this.
It's very difficult, but I do think there is. One of the things that moved me in the recent footage was the 85-year-old Israeli lady who was released by Hamas. I think she was one of the first two to be released, and the cameras showed her being handed over to the Red Crescent by two Hamas masked gunmen, and she was handed over, and then she turned round and she put her hand out to one of the gunmen who just released her, and offered her hand, which thankfully he accepted. He shook hands and waved, and she said, "Shalom, peace." And tiny incident, but very, very meaningful. And I think eventually they will have to come together on a political level around a table, and it surely is in Israel's long-term interest that it has to come to an accommodation, that critical land between the river and the sea, and divide it between the two of them, for two states. A one-state solution I don't think will work. It would be the end of the Jewish majority and the end of a Jewish state. That wouldn't never be acceptable. But I think some sort of Palestinian state on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, maybe an international settlement for Jerusalem, or that might take a lot longer to decide. But a Palestinian homeland, maybe in the two wings, West Bank and Gaza, and again with a more mature Palestinian polity and leadership. Mahmoud Abbas is now 87. He's got no democratic legitimacy. There's been no elections since 2005, and there has to be a stop. But there have been breakthroughs. That the Oslo Accords in 1999 were signed between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and they still to this day govern the arrangements, the organisation of the West Bank that I described before. Gaza was kept out of it, and as I say, Hamas has got no international recognition, and they want Israel wiped off the map, and Israel wants them wiped off the map. So, but some sort of Palestinian state, fully sovereign state with West Bank and the Gaza. They're not contiguous territories, as you know, but there has been talk in the past and times of more warm détente where they've discussed some sort of motorway and maybe a rail link linking the two, as there was between West Germany and West Berlin before the Berlin Wall fell. Solutions are possible, very, very difficult at the moment, but Israel seems to be digging deeper and deeper a hole of its own making, and it'll just make it harder for its own long-term security. One of the most encouraging things I've heard too is Joe Biden. I mean, total support for Israel on day one, but since then we've heard him say there has to be a pathway to Palestinian statehood. And I think that, and if he's saying that in public, one hopes that he's saying it much more firmly to the Israelis in private.
That was Phil Crane. After the break, we hear from Joni Farragher. Why does Joni Farragher think the Isle of Man's voice needs to be heard on the tragedy unfolding in the Middle East? It's quite a shocking situation, really, isn't it?
It really is, yeah, and I think that's my stance as a peace advocate, and I am a peace advocate. I've always been a peace advocate. Is that we really do need to call an immediate ceasefire, allow humanitarian aid into the area to the level that's needed, and really, I mean, I suppose just follow what the experts are telling us. The United Nations, the International Criminal Court, of course, the ICC, are now trying to get in. They've been standing at Rafah border and making their statements as well. And I think a pause. I don't support a pause, actually. It's a ceasefire, a full ceasefire, but in even the most recent UN resolution, which did pass, the only one that has so far on ceasefire, contained the words humanitarian truce, which would lead, in its own words, to the cessation of hostilities. This continuation of revenge killing and violence is not going to move towards a resolution. And I think before this situation started, I would have assumed that was what we all wanted. I'm not as sure anymore, actually, whether that is what everybody wants, because supporting ongoing violence to such an extent of the civilian lives that we've seen lost is absolutely unconscionable and unjustifiable.
And yet, anyone making any comment on this is accused by one side or the other of being pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. It's got into such a embittered position between the two sides now, and the actions that were taken by Hamas that initiated all this. I mean, it's hard to understand just how people in Israel must feel about that. And I mean, do you, to any extent, do you sympathise with the rage that they must feel and the anger that they must feel?
To a huge extent, I sympathise, and my heart absolutely goes out to everybody who is lost loved ones, and everybody in this situation who has experienced their loved ones being taken and held hostage on both sides. As we do know from recent coverage, Israel is holding about 1,200 Palestinian prisoners without charge and under quite significant suffering conditions, according to reports undertaken by international human rights organisations. But I do absolutely sympathise, and this is exactly what I'm trying trying to sort of say, first of all, I must take exception to your word used that this was initiated on the 7th of October. This has a very, very long history. This has not been initiated recently. It's been continued to a very, very ferocious, extreme extent on the 7th of October that we saw. And that is absolutely heartbreaking, I think, and devastating for me as an objective observer, and for hopefully many people across the world. But that does not justify another response that is even more extreme. We can never justify the targeting of civilians, and one war crime does not justify another war crime. We have to be mature and responsible and actually look at how we can resolve this situation. When I was doing A-level politics, one of the questions that came up every single year, and we had to continually write essays as practice for our exam, was are the troubles in Northern Ireland insoluble? Because that was the general feeling at the time, that the bitterness, the animosity, the hatred, the anger was so entrenched, so deep running, that it could never ever be resolved. But we know in the situation that we're standing in now, it was resolved, and the way that it was resolved was through peace talks, was through cessation of hostility, through ceasefire, and through actual collaboration and understanding on both sides of the hurt that's been experienced. We will never move forward in this situation if we continue to endorse war crimes and violence on both sides.
And indeed, the conflict in Northern Ireland certainly has ceased, or to a very large extent. But the level of animosity between two communities still exists. And part of the problem here, of course, and it's the same with the Middle East, isn't it? You have centuries-old, possibly even millennia-old arguments, very firmly ingrained in people's minds. Very, very difficult to see how a resolution to particularly the situation in the Middle East at the moment, how that can be resolved.
It is difficult to see how it can be resolved, absolutely. I think when you look at through the history, this does date back. It far predates what happened in post World War II, when the United Nations granted Israel a home there, or sort of essentially partitioned that land. It dates back really over 100 years, and this. If we look at recent times, I think the United States has been quite a key player in what's happened, and that is probably the only way that we can look to resolve this situation and move forward. When Barack Obama was the president of the United States, he gave a talk in Cairo, and in his speech he did say the constant taking of Palestinian land by Israel has to stop. He said it's unconscionable, it cannot be justified, and it must stop. 10 days after that, Benjamin Netanyahu called an emergency meeting. And after that, he announced for the first time the recognition of a demilitarised Palestinian state. Now, that was widely regarded as a response to what Obama had said in his Cairo speech. And following that, he did offer a truce. I mean, it was along very difficult lines, I think, for the Palestinian leaders to accept, because it gave a lot of a whole raft really of limitations, as well as saying that Israel would continue to take land in the West Bank. So that was rejected. But what we can see from that that was an opportunity, actually, and there have been several opportunities over the years when Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin undertook the Oslo peace accords, and that was signed. But then obviously an extremist far right Israeli assassinated Yitzhak Rabin because that person didn't agree with the terms of the Oslo Accord. All of these teachable moments, all of these points at which things could have been turned around, needed to have been seized with much more a much more positive and willingness to do something about this than they have been. And I think we kind of need to take that and learn from that the United States and the United Kingdom, I mean, I don't know how much, but the United Kingdom seem to follow whatever the United States do on this. And I think international pressure on the United States will then put pressure upon both Palestine and Israel to actually get together and look to how they can move this forward. But it will not move forward when we continue to endorse war.
Is there anybody now that has the sort of standing that the United States of America had back then? In probably it was waning even in Barack Obama's time, but now we have America seen by many as much weaker than it was, and certainly in quite some degree of turmoil internally. How can America really speak out on any? I suppose I'm asking you: is America really still that guiding voice that perhaps it used to be, or has it lost its importance?
That's quite a big question, I suppose. I think in terms of the international stage, the US is clearly still a huge player. In terms of whether it's lost its gravitas and the respect of people who aren't in the Western world, I'm not sure about that. I would suggest that certainly in this current conflict, that has corroborated people's impression that the US doesn't have the maturity and the responsibility actually to retain its place as a world leader. Whether that will impact whether it retains its place as a world leader, though, is a different matter completely. But of course, the US should be striving to hold people's respect and to hold that level of responsibility as a huge international player. And I don't think that it's played its hand at all in this very well. I think it's really shirked its responsibilities, very sadly, to the detriment of thousands of people.
And yet America had a very dark period. 9/11, which is well documented, led America reacting possibly in a similar way with similar rage to the way Israel's reacting now.
Indeed, and where did that lead? It certainly didn't lead to a positive outcome, and I think we repeatedly fail to learn from mistakes made by societies, and it's terrifying actually, but it does worry me that we cannot see that actually what should have happened is that responsible global leaders should have urged a pause for Israel to mourn its dead, and for Israel to try to take stock of what's happened and to actually find a way forwards in this. Because saying Israel has a right to defend itself ignores the fact that we could equally say Palestine has a right to defend itself, and that is enshrined in international law, that Palestine as a people has a right to defend itself, including in armed conflict when its land is being encroached upon, and that isn't up for debate. That is a fact that its land is being repeatedly taken.
And yet. You talk about maybe a pause for mourning. Hamas were firing rockets into Israel, for the week following, at least, possibly still are.
But how much of that? I think we don't know how much of that is a response to ongoing hostilities, and I think it's very difficult to try to actually discuss this without appearing that you're coming down on one side or another, because actually, and I mean, just to give you a brief bit about my background, the reason that my awareness is maybe slightly above average of these issues is because I did a postgraduate degree in the Holocaust, in Holocaust studies it was entitled, but the main thrust of that was what makes atrocities possible, how do governments sanction atrocities, and I think the main two, I wrote my whole thesis on the main two lessons that we haven't learned, which is first of all that the othering of people, we haven't learned the lesson from the othering of people, the dehumanisation of people, and the secondly, the response on every individual to ensure that the information that they're receiving aligns with their own conscience, and that we are able to actually have a little question in our head. We don't abdicate our responsibility to a higher authority. And those two lessons we have never learned from historical atrocities. And we seem to still be there. We seem to still think that we can abdicate our responsibility to other people, that it doesn't really matter if we agree with it or not. And actually it is the responsibility of every single individual to call out injustice where they see it. And so that's the background of why I became interested in this. And I think it's quite relevant, really, because it is my view, and it is the view of international humanitarian organisations, and it is the view of the United Nations, that what we're witnessing is an atrocity.
There will be some people listening to this programme who will say, well, the Isle of Man, Joni's an MHK. What's this got to do with the Isle of Man government? And actually, the Isle of Man, even if the Isle of Man did speak out internationally on this topic, who's going to listen?
Yeah, and I can have full sympathy with that, to be honest. I can fully see why people would say that. I think we have to work within our sphere. We have to work within the field that we are in. So with the material that's in front of us, we have a relationship with the United Kingdom. You may or may not know that in 2002, when the war in Iraq was ongoing, that the Jersey government actually passed a motion that they didn't support that it wasn't in their name. So there are actions that we can take that would at least ensure that we are standing on the right side of history, and they might have some small influence. So we have discussed that I wrote an email to the Chief Minister, and I requested whether he would liaise with the Chief Ministers of the other two Crown Dominions, Jersey and Guernsey, to see if there would be appetite for lobbying the United Kingdom to call for a ceasefire. I've received a response back to that is not positive. So, but as far as I'm concerned, at least.
So you say it's not positive. Was it a detailed explanation, or was it just no? I'm not going to do that.
It was somewhere in the middle, actually.
Right.
It really did say that international issues are the UK's responsibility, and not really for us to interfere with. And I guess it kind of gave a bit of a view that there are always casualties in war, which is absolutely true. But I would probably contend that the level of civilian casualties in this is beyond anything that we've ever seen. And really, I think the closest we can get to a comparison is actually to look at the troubles in Northern Ireland, and that. If imagine during the nail bombing of that happened, or the train bombing in Birmingham, there were several things that happened in the United Kingdom. If England had then said, we're now going to bomb Belfast, we are now going to raze it to the ground, we are going to bomb heavily civilian populated areas, that would not have been a conscionable. Nobody would have thought that was a just, proportionate, fair response to take. So it cannot be seen that this is a just, fair, proportionate response to take in this situation. It's ongoing. One child dies every 15 minutes, according to those grim statistics that the human rights organisations have given us. This is just it's unjustified on every level.
And I suppose then the question to you is, why is this? Why is it even worth me spending an hour of people's time on a Sunday afternoon considering this issue? The international community, you would like to think, is considering this. Why is it important for Manx people to have views and be informed about this?
Well, I suppose there are a couple of reasons for me. First of all, are we not all human beings? Do we not all seek to and strive to do better and actually learn from the examples that are both historical and contemporary? But secondly, I think, without maybe being alarmist, but this is a situation that might escalate. I think, that's widely accepted, that surrounding nations might get involved, or already are actually involving themselves. I don't think that we can say that we are in a complete separated bubble from the rest of the world. I think it's important that each one of us, as was the topic of my postgraduate dissertation, ensures that the information that we're receiving aligns with our own sense of morals and our own conscience. And that way we will be able to achieve a resolution in this situation and in other situations as they arise as well.
That was Joni Farragher, MHK. Adrian Kane spent time in Israel and Northern Ireland and taught politics before he got involved with the Manx language. You actually spent some time on a kibbutz in your early life. I suppose what I think it would be interesting for people who only ever witness this through media and have never had the opportunity to go, to actually understand a bit more about what it's like in Israel and what people on the kibbutz at the time you were there, what were they thinking? What was their outlook on life?
Well, yeah, it was a long time ago. But I was tell this story. The first guy I worked with, Chezi, on the kibbutz, and people said, "Oh, Chezi's a bit crazy." So he's a plumber. So after the first day, he gets his arm, rolls up his sleeve, and he says to me, he shows me the tattoo on his arm. He says, "Look, I was born and brought up in Prague, but I got this in Auschwitz." And I always, and he said, "You can't ask me any questions about that." I thought, what am I going to ask anyway? But you'd see people in Israel, and it really brought it home to me on buses, with these tattoos on their arms, late middle-aged people. And certainly in the kibbutz I was in, I was always amazed that these are Israelis. A guy I worked with in the kitchen is from Iraq. I'd sort of a couple of the young people I knew, their family from the Yemen. And these were all people who'd ineffectively, as a consequence of the creation state of Israel, late 1940s, had ineffectively had to leave Yemen and Iraq, really. They were no longer safe places for them to live, and they'd come to the state of Israel. The people from Russia there as well, and later on Ethiopians. And I remember talking to some of the kibbutzniks, as you'd refer to them, about, where did their attitude and beliefs, and socialism was quite a significant part of that. And, loads of them had escaped Europe, really, from, oppression, pogroms and the like. The best guy to read about this, I think, is a Israeli writer who started reading when he was there, called Amos Oz, who died a few years ago, who wrote about the sort of tragedy of Israel, how it went from this attempted, quite left-wing experiment in a way, certainly in the kibbutzim and stuff like that, slowly, because of the nature of the conflict with Palestine and Arab countries, became, lost that, I suppose that goal and that vision, and increasingly became a militaristic society, really. And all Israelis do military service. I think the consequence of winning all the wars over the years is becoming increasingly militarized, confident, arrogant, unquestionably, about their role in the Middle East, fairly increasingly dismissive of Arabs. And of course, one thing you must forget, obviously I'm a Christian, a significant Christian tradition in the Middle East. Although they say there are more Christians from Bethlehem who live in America now than actually live in Bethlehem. And the Christian community has increasingly been as dissipated as both Israel has become more right-wing, populist, and the Arab nations, and certainly Hamas and stuff like that, have become increasingly radicalized. So it's a tragedy, really, in that sort of vision, which I certainly was interested in when I was in the kibbutz, has dissipated. But Israel's a different country now. It's become a populist country. And it's worth certainly listening to anything by Harari, the intellect, the Israeli. He does lots of stuff about AI. He's often on, in The Guardian. He's a brilliant writer. And he often writes about this as well. Both his parents live in one of the kibbutzim where the attacks happened. They both survived. And he would, before this, he was writing very much about the way in which Israel now has become increasingly divided, increasingly radicalized, increasingly right-wing, increasingly populist, and that's thanks to Benjamin Netanyahu. But we were just talking before that, the there's a parallel here, which is in Northern Ireland. And I used to live in Northern Ireland as well. And I had a very dangerous time, really, which I remember vividly. And I was going over lots of stuff. There's a brilliant programme, Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland, which goes through the creation of the Troubles, as they're called, through the horror, tit-to-tat, someone put a bomb off, another group would murder people in a pub, all this sort of stuff, pogrom-type stuff, really, to the peace process. And that was done by politicians who made a decision that there needs to be peace, whether it be Mark McGuinness, maybe it's also American involvement, Bill Clinton, Bertie Ahern, they'd all made, their political leadership made a commitment towards peace. Maybe not everyone believed in that, but they did. And the guy to listen to, I think, is Patrick Keelty, the comedian, whose father was shot by the UFF. And he talks very openly about this and how, it didn't seem there could possibly be peace in Northern Ireland. However, there is peace of sorts. People don't agree, but not going around killing each other. So it is possible, but it has to come from leadership, I think. And you can't really see that coming from either side, whether it be the Netanyahu government or Hamas. And when it boils down to it, what Hamas did in the kibbutzim was about creating a response. It was about having their own people killed. They did that expecting Israel to do something awful, and the consequence of that would be killing loads of civilians in Gaza. But that's the way in which, when you get stuck in a cycle of violence, look in Europe, look in what happened in a place like Srebrenica. It's not too long ago, is it? You get this cycle of violence. One group kill another, who respond by killing more of the other, and it's difficult then to get out of that cycle of violence. It happened in Northern Ireland. Whether that's possible, it'd have to come from people getting involved, like America, Europe, Saudi Arabia, basically sort of saying enough is enough, but that doesn't look likely.
You also, as part of your incredibly productive life, were a teacher, and you used to teach politics. If you had Benjamin Netanyahu and the leader of Hamas in your class, what would be the lessons that you would be trying to teach?
Wow, well, I have no idea. They've both got themselves in a bind, haven't they? Really. But Netanyahu really represents a move towards populism throughout the world, really. You only have to look in Europe for populist nations who promise so much and deliver so little and then blame other people for it. That's what Netanyahu would seem to me would be about, really. But, Israel's, the tragedy of both Israel... I read a brilliant book years ago called Palestinian Walks, which is one of the best books I read about conflict. And it's so tragic about how this Palestinian lawyer, how his walks and the walks of his parents and grandparents have become smaller and smaller and smaller in the West Bank because of expansion of settlements there and slow incremental stealing of land, for that is what it is. And that's been allowed to go on for too long, really, because I think that may be slightly romantic vision of Israel when it was founded, associated with the kibbutzim, so Amos Oz no longer, to what extent it exists. And Harari, this is, I think, the interesting point, Harari, the Israeli intellectual of today, one of the points he made recently in The Guardian was, ironically, Hamas, what they did in the kibbutzim near to God, they killed a lot of the liberal, left-wing, such the pro, in inverted commas, Palestinian community. So some of the people they kidnapped were people who have worked with the Palestinian community, got them into Israel to go to hospital and stuff. It might not be perfect at all, but a lot of them, I know one of the people, the women, older women who's released, her husband was a writer. He'd been in Lebanon and witnessed some of the atrocities and knew a lot, people in Gaza. So Harari is saying the great tragedy is what is left of that liberal, progressive tradition in Israel. Some of it was in those kibbutzim and were killed as a consequence, as well as Arab Bedouin who just happened to get in the crossfire. tragedy, you know.
That was Adrian Kane. Does our close neighbour Northern Ireland offer hope for a peaceful solution to the tragedy unfolding in the Middle East? Are there political giants left in the world who are capable of developing a roadmap to peace? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at maxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Gora Maius and Geisachrom. Thanks for listening.